Welcome back to another episode of Wuthering Heights, a Reader's Guide. In last week's episode, we looked at one of the big dichotomies in Wuthering Heights, revenge versus forgiveness. This week we're going to look at another one of those big dichotomies, nature versus civilization. I'll be looking at how Wuthering Heights can be seen as a battle between nature, represented by Wuthering Heights and the characters who dwell there, and civilization, represented by Thrushcross Grange and the characters who live there. Part 1. Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Nearly all of the action in Wuthering Heights takes place between two locations, the rugged and wild and primitive Wuthering Heights and the civilised, refined and pretty Thrushcross Grange. This is actually quite an interesting device in itself because it creates a timeless atmosphere to the story. There doesn't seem to be really much of any world outside of these locations, so it just gives it that timeless, ethereal sort of mood that stays with it throughout the entire book. What's also great about these locations is that the theme of nature and civilization comes out in everything to do with these places, in the names of the places, in the way that they're described, and also in the ways that the places personify the nature of the characters who live in them. Let's start by looking at Wuthering Heights. So the term wuthering refers to stormy winds. Combine this with heights and you already have this suggestion of a wild mountainous terrain that's been blasted by the elements. Let's look at what Lockwood himself says when he sees Wuthering Heights, along with us the readers, for the first time. Wuthering Heights is the name of Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Wuthering being a significant provincial adjective, descriptive of the atmospheric tumult to which its station is exposed in stormy weather. Pure, bracing ventilation they must have up there at all times. Indeed, one may never guess the power of the north wind blowing over the edge, by the excessive slant of a few stunted firs at the end of the house, and by a range of gaunt thorns, all stretching their limbs one way, as if craving alms of the sun. Happily, the architect had foresight to build it strong. The narrow windows are deeply set in the wall, and the corners defended with large jutting stones. So on one side you have this strong, stout house that's being blasted constantly by the wild elements, and then on the other end of the spectrum you have the refined and really sweet Thrushcross Grange. Again, before we even get the description of the Grange, everything is in the name. A thrush is a small, pretty songbird, and a grange refers to a country house that's attached to some farmland. These two things together suggest two things. One, the thrush represents something sweet, pretty and beautiful, and a grange represents civilization. You have got some natural elements to that with the farmhouse bit, but it's land that's been tamed and cultivated by human activity, rather than Wuthering Heights, which is wild and crazy and a little bit scary. Both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, as you'll see when you read the book, personify their inhabitants right down to a T. And sometimes they even seem to influence the characters who move into them, as if the houses themselves have this magical power to either make someone more civilized or make them more primitive. The children of Wuthering Heights, Catherine, Heathcliff and Hindley, actually could be described as wuthering themselves. They have these unpredictable tempers that when they explode, they really explode and destroy everything around them, much like a whirlwind or a tornado. Meanwhile, you've got Edgar and Isabella, who, when we first meet them, are, dainty, small children that need to be protected. They're crying when we first see them because they've done something wrong, and they're civilized and cultivated just like the land on the Grange. Although Wuthering Heights is embodied in the Earnshaws and Heathcliff, and Thrushcross Grange is embodied in the Lintons, the way that the characters embody these places and the broader themes of nature and civilization change as they grow up, and the story and the world around them begins to change. So in the next two parts, we're going to look at how things change as these characters change. Part 2. Heathcliff versus Edgar. Nature versus civilization. Heathcliff is the perfect embodiment of Wuthering Heights and nature, and Edgar is the perfect embodiment of Thrushcross Grange and civilization. Bronté makes this clear throughout the novel by constantly contrasting the appearances of these two men, always making really clear that Heathcliff is this threatening, dangerous and unpredictable force, while Edgar is this slightly fey, well-groomed and cultivated force. Nellie and Heathcliff have a very revealing conversation about the differences between the two boys' appearances.
Edgar Linton shall look quite a doll beside you, and that he does. You are younger, and yet, I'll be bound, you are taller and twice as broad across the shoulders. You could knock him down in a twinkling. Don't you feel that you could? Heathcliff's face brightened a moment. Then it was overcast afresh, and he sighed. But Nellie, if I knocked him down 20 times, that wouldn't make him less handsome, or me more so. I wish I had a light hair and a fair skin, and was dressed and behaved as well, and had a chance of being as rich as he will be." "And cried for mamma at every turn," I added, "and trembled if a country lad heaved his fist against you, and sat at home all day for a shower of rain."
Heathcliff is not the most handsomest child in the world. He's rugged, he's wild, and he's happy to get stuck in the mud, to get into scraps. Edgar, on the other hand, is very pretty, very handsome, but ultimately a bit of a wimp. He stays inside, he reads his books, and he would never get into a fight, unless he was forced to do so. Nellie even goes so far as to say that Edgar looks like a doll next to Heathcliff, which really highlights the difference in their appearances and in their characters. Heathcliff, and Catherine as well, embrace the wild tempests of nature, playing out on the moors, just getting dirty and doing all the crazy things that adventurous kids do. And when we first see Edgar, along with his sister, they're inside, in the warm, crying. Another key way that Edgar and Heathcliff represent nature and civilization is not just by their appearances, but by the way that they act and their characters. Heathcliff often acts outside of society. Even when he's away making his fortunes, we don't know exactly what he's doing out there, but there's lots of suggestion that the way that he got that money was not by embracing society and doing the right thing. Like nature, Heathcliff just doesn't care about society's rules and laws. If they're in his way, then he will move them out of the way. Compare this to Edgar, whose actions, even when he's being especially cruel, are always within the bounds of society and its laws. With one exception, where he physically assaults Heathcliff, he's always playing within those rules and never willing to break them, even when breaking them would do a lot of good for him or the people around him. A good example of Edgar being unwilling to go against society's rules is when he gets Heathcliff's and Elizabeth's son, Linton, to stay with him until Heathcliff finds out and then wants his son to live with him. Edgar doesn't try and hold on to Linton. He's not willing to break the law that says that the son should live with the father. He's not willing to do that. So he just gives him up because he'd rather not live an unconventional life. Likewise with Isabella, when she chooses to step outside of civilization and marry Heathcliff, he then wants nothing to do with her because she's chosen to step outside and he's not willing to go there or involve himself with that wilder side of life. As a representative of civilization, Edgar is probably the most passive and neutered character in the whole story. He'll only ever act within the bounds of the law and society and convention, and this has disastrous consequences. Not so much for him, but for most of his family. Heathcliff, on the other hand, does not care about those rules, and that's why he is such an active and destructive character. And that's why, for most of the novel anyway, he gets exactly what he wants. He's willing to break the laws to his whims, he's willing to go with his emotions and be strong, and that gives him power and strength and action, whereas Edgar, paragon of civilization, is passive and, in my view, hopeless. Part 3. Catherine and Isabella, fraternising with the enemy. So at the beginning of the novel, Catherine and Isabella are pretty much the same as Heathcliff and Edgar. Catherine and Heathcliff are the wild savages at Wuthering Heights, and they're doing their savage, crazy fun games on the moors. Edgar and Isabella are the cultivated, nice kids in the posh house, just doing whatever posh kids do in nice houses. But as the novel progresses, Catherine finds herself attracted to the world of the Grange, and in particular Edgar, and Isabella finds herself attracted to the world of the Heights, and especially through Heathcliff. Now, the love triangle between Catherine, Edgar and Heathcliff, which is the main thing in the first part of the novel anyway, could be seen at a literal level or at a more symbolic level. Symbolically, it could be seen on a couple of levels. One, probably the more obvious one, is class, because Catherine is someone who belongs to the lower orders, at least at the beginning. Heathcliff is even lower than she is as a servant, and Catherine finds herself caught between these two sides. That being said, I think there is much more to it than just a class romance, and instead, I would say it's more importantly a battle between the two sides of Catherine's nature. Her desire to be civilized and have the comforts of that kind of world, but also her desire to be free and boundless like Heathcliff and nature. And the love triangle could essentially just be seen as Catherine's internal battle being represented by Heathcliff and Edgar, those two sides of her personality, the civilized one, the wild one. Catherine's whole character arc certainly does centre on this conflict that she has. I think it's pretty clear that in choosing to marry Edgar, this is the wrong choice for Catherine, because it has lasting and damaging, well, fatal consequences on her character. As soon as she marries Edgar, and Heathcliff leaves the story for the first time, Catherine starts to become weaker. She becomes neutered when she enters this world of civilization, because suddenly she's expected to follow these rules, which mean that she has to act in a certain way, not just as a woman, but as a human being who's entering society. She has to submit to Edgar, and this ultimately is why Edgar's allowed to stop her from seeing Heathcliff. And also, because you're part of high society, you have to keep your emotions in check. You can't be going crazy and screaming like she would have done in the past, or like Heathcliff would. You've got to keep everything buried inside. And for Catherine, this is really damaging because she's a wild, passionate person. You've got to remember that before she marries Edgar, she slapped him across the face. This is an untamable creature, and she's now been put in a cage. I think through Catherine's storyline, Brontë is trying to tell us what society can do to a person, especially a person like Catherine who's in touch with her impulsive, natural side. Civilization ultimately breaks Cathy's mind, leaving her a vegetable. At the start of the story, when she's a kid, she's asking her dad for a whip for a present. This is someone who is dominant, this is someone who wants to control. And by the end of the novel, she's lost control, and not in a good way. She's completely powerless, and she withers away. The reason why I think this is more about nature than class is because of the way that Catherine describes her relationship to nature.
I wish I were out of doors. I wish I were a girl again, half savage and hardy and free, and laughing at injuries, not maddening under them. Why am I so changed? Why does my blood rush in a hell of tumult at a few words? I'm sure I would be myself, were I once among the heather on those hills. Open the window again wide, fasten it open. Quick, why don't you move? Because I won't give you your death of cold, I answered. You won't give me a chance at life, you mean, she said sullenly.
For a normal human being, you would not want to be out in the wild moors getting blasted by the cold air, because that would make you even more ill. But Catherine, she needs to be out there. At least she psychologically needs to be out there. She recognises that once she was free on the moors, carefree, able to do what she wanted, and now she's trapped inside. The windows and doors are all barred to her now, and Nellie, in keeping her inside, as Catherine rightly says, is actually killing her, because Catherine is a character who needs to be out there on the moors. So if Catherine's story is a story about how society will repress and weaken you, what about Isabella, who goes from the civilized world into the wild world of Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights? I think Isabella's story is a little bit more positive. What's interesting about Isabella as a character is that before she goes to Wuthering Heights, she's essentially in the background for most of the story. And this already says something maybe about what society does to people. I've already said that Edgar is passive, but Isabella as a woman in society is even more passive because she's barely even visible. It's only when she steps outside of that and goes into nature that she becomes a much bigger and fuller character. So before she marries Heathcliff, she is like Edgar, civilized, kind, quiet and reserved, but everything changes after she marries Heathcliff, and we see this when Nellie goes to visit her at Wuthering Heights and remarks on how much her appearance has changed now that she's living there with Heathcliff.
She already partook of the pervading spirit of neglect which encompassed her. Her pretty face was wan and listless, her hair uncurled, some locks hanging lankly down, and some carelessly twisted around her head. Probably she had not touched her dress since yester evening.
So already, at least physically, Isabella has come to represent the wild and rugged side of life. But at this point, Isabella hasn't really changed much inside. In this scene, she's still begging Nellie to get her out of the situation. She still wants her brother to get her out of it. So she's not quite as active as someone like Catherine before she married Edgar or Heathcliff. She's still one foot in the door in that civilized world that she belonged to. But the more time that she spends with Heathcliff, the more her character changes. At one point, she sees Hindley's gun and fantasises about how powerful that gun would make her. She doesn't ever use it, but she does eventually use her own wit and intelligence to get herself out of her situation. She encourages a fight between Hindley and Heathcliff, and the moment that they start fighting each other, she just gets straight out of there and escapes and frees herself. And for Isabella, this means living life still in a sense outside of society, because she runs away with Linton and lives as a single mother, doing, I guess, reasonably well in another place, until sadly she dies. Through Isabella, I think Brontë communicates a more positive message about getting in touch with nature and with that side of your character. In the world of Wuthering Heights, nature is what gives you power, and so when Isabella fraternizes with that side of things, She gets a voice for herself, and while that does cause a lot of trouble for her because she's with Heathcliff and that's a terrible relationship, it also gives her the power to ultimately escape and strike out on her own. If she'd have stayed at Thrushcross Grange, she would have just been Edgar's sister, compliant, submissive, and nice enough, but ultimately passive just like Edgar is, if not more so. By going to Wuthering Heights, she goes through some terrible things, but she also gets power, because whenever you identify yourself with that side in this book, you seem to get power, whereas when you identify yourself with Civilisation, you become diminished. One more thing to say about Isabella though, it is important to note that she does die, and in escaping the world of Wuthering Heights, that could be read as her sort of avoiding the conflict altogether, wanting to stay out of it, and ultimately because Linton ends up back in that world, it kind of suggests that Isabella isn't all that successful of escaping, because while she does get to live the rest of her life out there, Linton is brought back into the fray, and so the story goes on. Part 4. Conclusion. Who wins, nature or civilization? So in this battle between civilization and nature, which one is the winner? Now, I haven't focused too much on the second generation, but I think you do need to look at the end of the novel in order to answer this question. Cathy and Hareton get married, and they leave Wuthering Heights to Joseph to essentially crumble, and they go to Thrushcross Grange, where they possibly have a great life together. So you could take this ending as being that civilization is the winner, but I think that is to ignore maybe a few things. First of all, that's not the last part of the book. The very last scene in the book is when we have the 3 graves of Catherine, Edgar and Heathcliff, and Heathcliff's grave is described as standing there as this big white slab as opposed to the other 2 that have been kind of aged by time. And there's something about the imagery of that scene to me, this Heathcliff stone standing in defiance on the moors, which kind of undercuts the happy lover ending that we had a few pages before. So I think that there is maybe a little bit more nuance to which side really wins. Maybe instead it's more like civilization wins for now, but nature and death is always there on the horizon. But what I would like to do is maybe summarize this in terms of how these themes affect the characters that we've talked about in this video. So I'm briefly going to go over all the characters again and say my thoughts on what I think their identification with nature or civilization, or somewhere between, says about the overall message of the story. So Heathcliff. Heathcliff is the embodiment of nature at its most extreme. He never fraternizes with civilization. He is always a slave to his passions and his emotions, and this makes him the most powerful character in the story. Even though he dies at the end of the story, of all of the first generation characters, he is one of the ones that lives the longest. That being said, Heathcliff's nature, his character, is not a particularly good one. He's incapable of feeling finer emotions because he is so wild and base, and this isn't good for him. It's not good for anyone else either. So I think through Heathcliff we get a mixed message. On the one hand, aligning yourself with nature makes you strong and powerful, but on the other hand, it takes you out of finer emotions like love and compassion, which you need to be a good person. Now for Catherine. Catherine is much like Heathcliff in that she is, like Heathcliff, a slave to her passions, and this is something that doesn't actually go away when she enters the civilised world of Thrushcross Grange. Maybe if it did, she'd have lived happily, but it didn't. She always kept clinging to nature, and she wanted to stay there. I think though the tragedy of Catherine is not so much aligning yourself with either side, it's more about repression. Cathy places herself in a repressive environment, and this is something that ultimately drains her of her power and kills her. So the message here is, don't give yourself wholly to civilization, because it will trap you. You need to keep some of yourself, you need to have a certain authenticity, and it becomes much harder to do that when you enter society. Edgar is essentially the anti-Heathcliff. He represents civilization at its most extreme. And this means that Edgar, of our principal 4 characters here, is the most passive. He asks Catherine to marry him even after she physically assaults him. He's unwilling to help his sister because that would mean maybe getting his hands dirty. And he's also unwilling to help his nephew Linton and keep him away from the dangers of Heathcliff. He's also too scared with his own daughter to raise her with any awareness of the wider world. He keeps her trapped in the house because he's afraid of the darker side of life. He's afraid of nature. He doesn't want any association with it. And this makes for a passive, weak character, and in my personal opinion, one of the worst characters in the book. Edgar eventually just withers away of an illness because he's sickly and weak, and That's what Civilisation does to you, at least according to Emily Bronté. Isabella, well, she could have turned into Edgar, but instead she chooses Heathcliff and she has that flirtation with nature, and that has a positive effect on her character. Rather than continue to be a passive victim, which is what her brother is, she takes action, she becomes powerful, and she gets herself out of the bad situation that she's in. That being said, she never fully gives herself up to her passions. She becomes angry and she has emotions and she expresses them, but unlike Heathcliff and Catherine, who let these emotions burn them up like a fire, Isabella has the refinement, you might say, of Civilisation to control her emotions but still live an authentic life. And it's for this reason that I think that Isabella, of the four characters, is the ultimate winner. She's the only one that escapes and lives a decent-ish life, I guess, until unfortunately she does die. Ultimately then, I think that in terms of the nature versus civilization theme, neither of them really wins. Instead, it's just a constant battle that will always continue on, even if one of them wins now and one of them wins then. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about what I've said about nature and civilization. Do you think that Bronté is more on the side of one or the other? Do you think that Isabella is the exemplar of the four main characters? Let me know in the comments. I look forward to talking about that with you. Don't forget to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. I'll be posting up the next episode next Thursday. Until then, take care everyone, and I'll see you all next time.